So once again, welcome everybody to our second plenary address for our On the Same Page, Bring Your Genes to Cal program. You'll meet in a moment this evening's speaker, Professor Alta Charo from the University of Wisconsin. But our On the Same Page program is sponsored by generous donors to the College of Letters and Science. It's also sponsored by QB3 that allowed us to use this wonderful auditorium this evening. And by Bolt Hall, or I should say the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, joins us in sponsoring this lecture. I want to advertise one more final upcoming event in the On the Same Page program that we've only locked in recently, and that's set for October the 11th. It'll be a panel discussion entitled Personal Stories from the Genetic Frontier. The head of this panel, the moderator of this panel, is Amy Harmon, who is a staff writer for the New York Times and the winner of a Pulitzer Prize for her series on the DNA age. So this was a series consisting of more than a dozen articles in the New York Times from 2007 to 2009. And Amy Harmon is bringing with her a number of patients with genetic diseases that she actually wrote about that are interested in talking to you about their experiences with genetic testing and with their diseases. We'll also have a physician, a breast cancer surgeon that uses genetic testing in his practice, and then a family member, a mom of a child with a chromosomal abnormality syndrome, all to talk about the implications to them personally of genetic testing results, and that's on October the 11th. I also want to point out to the students that we have a student contest going on, and the contest is to submit to us, to a panel of the deans, a creative work of some kind having to do with the theme of personalized medicine. It could be a poem, a short story, a piece of artwork. It's entirely up to you. And I encourage you to submit an entry into this contest, because there's a $1,000 prize for the winner and two $500 prizes for runners-up. And so far, there have only been 6 submissions. So if you calculate the odds are very, very good. No, faculty, I'm sorry, you always ask questions like that. No, faculty are not eligible. You have to be a student. Alex, is it any student any undergraduate student at UC Berkeley this semester is eligible to submit something, and it's up on our webpage, the details about the contest, on the same page at berkeley.edu. So please participate. So our speaker this evening, we're honored and very happy to host Alta Charo, who's the Warren Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics from the University of Wisconsin. Professor Charo was educated as an undergraduate at Harvard and received her law degree from Columbia University. She's worked in a series of posts both in academia and in the government. She's currently on leave from the University of Wisconsin since July of last year, working in the office of the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, helping advise the FDA about issues relating to genetics, nanotechnology, synthetic biology, lots of things that we actually care deeply about. Professor Charo is an expert in bioethics, having published over 100 scholarly works, books, articles, and reports for the government. She was elected to membership in the Institute of Medicine, which I can tell you for someone who isn't a medical doctor is actually quite a special honor, because medical doctors are quite the fraternity. She was a participant on the Obama-Biden transition team that worried about health and human services area issues, including the NIH, the Food and Drug Administration, issues about bioethics, stem cells, women's health. She's on the medical advisory committee, or has been, of Planned Parenthood, an ethics advisor to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. She sat on the National Academy of Sciences Stem Cell Research Guidelines Committee. She co-chaired that. She's helped advise CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, about ethical aspects of stem cell research. She's been on President Clinton's National Bioethics Advisory Board for 5 years, back in the late 90s. So she's obviously a public citizen as well as a scholar. Professor Charo was born in Brooklyn, New York, and I can't resist some of the tidbits that you were bold enough to put up on your website. She's fond of poker, foreign language study, cats, home renovation, Harry Potter books, old movies, roller coasters, salsa music, snorkeling, Jane Austen novels on either digital media or in actual real print, and Star Trek. So actually she belongs at Berkeley, to be honest. And I can say she was here at Berkeley, but she was a visiting professor at the Bolt Law School in 2006. So welcome to Professor Charo, who will deliver an address, Personal Genomics and Public Angst. Thank you.
Oh, the Star Trek gets them every time. Okay, let me just get this going here. Okay. First, thank you very much. It's late in the day or late in the evening, and I know that there's lots of other things that would tempt you, especially in a place as wonderful as Berkeley. I want to start with just some boilerplate that I actually have to give you. First, as he mentioned, I am on leave as a senior advisor in the Commissioner's Office at the FDA, but I am not speaking for the FDA. And since this is webcast, I want to make it extremely clear that I'm not speaking for the agency or of its policies or for any aspect of the federal government. So everything I say is in my personal capacity as an academic. And second, I'm used to doing this for medical schools at least, which is simply to tell you that I actually have no financial interests or any personal relationships with any for-profit entities that are in the business of making, selling, or using genetic tests. I want to talk today about something that goes beyond personalized medicine, although I understand that was the inspiration for some of the activities this semester. I really want to talk about the way in which genetics has kind of taken hold of our imaginations in the United States in particular, so that we have some context with which to understand how it is that people react when they're offered an opportunity to take a test, use the results, share the results, act upon the results, because sometimes the reactions can be a little bit perplexing to people who don't share the same set of instincts. Now, my own experience in genetics actually began primarily the summer after my sophomore year of high school. I was a student trainee lab tech at Downstate Medical Center, which was part of the State University of New York system. I was working in a genetics laboratory, which also had a clinical care component, and my job was to do karyotyping. Now, this was where amniotic fluid was being drawn off from women who were currently pregnant, usually in about mid-pregnancy. My job was to spin that fluid down in a centrifuge, explode the cell wall of the nucleus. In the old days, I would literally photograph the chromosomes and blow up the photograph and with a pair of scissors cut out each chromosome and match them by their banding, one to the next, one to the next, one to the next, one to the next, and you know that they come in pairs, right? So there was nothing more affecting than the sinking of my heart when I would suddenly notice that I had an odd rather than even number of chromosomes. Because if you had 3 chromosomes at site number 21 instead of 2, you knew now that the next thing that was going to happen is that this physician was going to walk back into an examination room and talk to this woman about the fact that her fetus was going to be born with Down syndrome, which then tended to be called mental retardation. And you would look at this and you would stare at this. I mean, literally, I'm actually cutting these things out and I'm counting as I'm pasting them on paper and hoping that maybe I'd made a mistake. And it was that kind of introduction to the power of genetics that really helped to create a lifelong interest in how the science of genetics has developed, what does it tell us, and also how do we react to that knowledge. So I'd like to spend some time this evening talking about 3 different themes. The first is the degree to which we've come to understand genetics as somehow being fundamental to our personal identities, often going way beyond what the science says and incorporating it for some of us into all sorts of meanings that are far more metaphoric than they are scientific. Also, in many cases, these meanings are then used by third parties, government and others, to our detriment on occasion. The second is I'd like to talk about the ways in which genetics is about seeing into the future. What will happen to me? This is most often in the context of disease-related genetics and this notion that somehow this tells me my fate, whether I'm going to be one of the lucky ones who lives to 99 or I'm going to be one of the unlucky ones who's felled by some terrible disorder at age 30. And of course, what will happen to me is also not just what happens to my body, but what other people do to me with that information. And then last, I want to talk about how it is that we think about genetics in the context of understanding what will happen to my children, because that's fraught not only with the notion of future prediction, but also with personal responsibility to do something about it, and the very fundamental nature of choice. So let me start with the question of, am I my genes? One of the first questions that people ask when a new baby's been born, we've had 2 new babies in my family just in the last summer, so I'm very big on babies these days. 2 new babies, and the very first thing that people tend to ask is it a girl or is it a boy? Right? And the question is actually more subtle than you realize. How are you supposed to answer if it's a girl or a boy? You know, traditionally we did it by looking at genitalia, and that was the answer. But you know, in the world of sports, we've had some interesting examples of that not quite working. So here we have 1996, and this is 30 years into the same problem. It starts back in the 60s with the East German swimmers, in which you have people who are not clearly defined as female by chromosomal status, and yet they might be by genitalia. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, when they suspected that these very muscular and very athletically accomplished women were actually men in disguise, the Olympics used to have women athletes parade naked in front of a set of doctors in order to prove through their genitalia that they were really female. And so it was considered a great progressive, enlightened improvement when we moved to genetic testing and we asked, well, let's look at their chromosomes. Do they have 2 X chromosomes, then they're female, or an X and a Y, in which case they're male? But here's the problem. You can have women athletes who actually have Y chromosomes, but their bodies act exactly like any other XX female body because their genetics is linked also to a particular disorder in which the thing that makes the Y kind of masculine, having to do with things like certain hormones, doesn't register in their bodies. We're calling it androgen insensitivity system. Their bodies develop just like any XX female's body. So are they male because they have a Y chromosome, or are they female because their bodies are kind of like the bodies of the other women athletes? And to some extent, the question is only answerable by asking, why are you concerned about whether they're male or female? And if the concern is somehow some abstract notion of maleness and femaleness, maybe chromosomes is the way to do it. If, on the other hand, it's about this notion of leveling the playing field in sport, then it makes more sense to look at whether or not people's bodies are functioning within some range that you want to use for your athletics, and you want to group people within certain ranges so that now you're testing not their innate advantages, but you're testing their determination and their training. Of course, we're very conflicted about this, aren't we? In boxing, we have featherweight and lightweight and heavyweight where we do exactly that so that we can really see the training of the boxer and not just whether or not one is heavier than the other. But I've never seen a short person's basketball league in which we would again be able to look at the see, they're laughing at me. They're laughing at me, but why do we not have that if we have a featherweight boxing group? Because we don't have a clear notion, even in sports, about exactly what it is we're celebrating. Are we celebrating the magnificent variation in human capacity in which some people are outliers, or are we celebrating the determination and training that anybody can have and use whatever they've got innately and enhance it with those techniques? And this is a big deal because sometimes it has tragic endings. This is more recent, 2006. A middle distance runner fails the sex determination test. She's stripped of her medals and subsequently attempts suicide over the international discussion about whether she's actually male or female, and nobody really knows because she's never been thoroughly tested for what it is that might account for this disparity between appearance and genetics. So, first question, who am I? Based in genetics, I would say that at least in the case of something as fundamental as who's a boy and who's a girl, or am I a boy or am I a girl, genetics doesn't necessarily answer the question. In fact, it can't possibly answer the question until we know what the question actually is. Let's take another not controversial concept like race and ethnicity. Increasingly, we hear people talk about genetic differences that define races. And by the way, this is not a recent innovation. This goes way back in Western history about trying to categorize people by all sorts of techniques. And biology is a very tempting tool because science has this image of being objective, of being above the political fray. You know, when you do when you've taken math classes and you've done your problem sets, the answer is either right or wrong, at least at this level of math. It gets a little bit different when you get a little further along. But it has this kind of satisfying rightness and wrongness, and all of science kind of benefits from that image. And so often when we have difficult social problems, we reach to science as some kind of neutral, objective arbiter. The abortion debate, well, right? Science says that X is alive, or science says X is not alive. And as if that answers the question of what is morally significant and legally significant, which is really the question that's on the table, for which science is only one of the many things you might discuss. Ditto with race and ethnicity. I don't know if you can see this well enough, but these people are wearing shirts that identify all the different categories that they've been in over the various centuries. You have somebody here, for example, who was Japanese back in the 1800s. She would be Korean in the mid-20th century, and then late in the 20th century, she becomes Asian. You've got somebody else who goes from being mulatto to Negro to having mixed race on the census. How is it that these categories can be so changeable if the categories are actually genetic or even biological? In fact, when you take a look at race and ethnicity, what you find is that, yes, there are certain patterns of some traits that seem to concentrate geographically, usually as a result of some kind of historical degree of reproductive isolation that allows for various founder effects to mean that certain traits are going to become predominant in a particular area. But the notion of race has changed far more than that. You know, it's not very long ago that the Irish, the Jews, the Greeks, the Italians were considered different races here in the United States. And yet now they'd all be considered white. So again, with genetics, very tempting to look for that as some kind of help in identifying who is who. And it's used in medical circles, in public health research, to some good effect and some bad effect, depending on how closely we hew to the reality, which is that it represents to some degree historical reproductive isolation, but doesn't necessarily reflect anything more profound until we ask, what's the context today? Do people who have a particular characteristic, whether it's an appearance or something else, live a certain way that determines for us a collection of cofactors we need to be examining? Closely linked to this question of race and ethnicity is the notion of who is my family. There's a kind of amnesia, I think, that we have, at least in the United States, I can't speak for other cultures, in which we always imagine the way it is now is the way it always was. And so this notion of the biological family is something that we have now. But if you go back to earlier parts of Western civilization, you find that there's a lot of family formation that is really quite independent of notions of blood or genes. In the Roman times, for example, quite common that people would essentially swap around children for the purpose of clarifying property transfer. And you saw that I'm a Jane Austen fan, and one of my favorite novels, of course, is Emma, in which one of the main characters, Frank Churchill, lives at a distance and has the name Churchill because he was given over to the maternal family and adopted in so that he could become the heir to the fortune, which is exactly what happened to Jane Austen's brother, Edward Knight, when he was adopted out to another family and became the guy with the money who then supported everybody back in the Austen family because her father was a rather modestly salaried clergyman. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we've seen tremendous changes in the United States over notions of adoption, starting with indentured servitude as the model, and then in the 19th century, reformers moving toward the idea that we should be looking at the best interests of the child, not as a source of labor, but as a source of family formation. And there came the notion that it had to be a recreation of a biological family. We had to eliminate from all legal record and all imagination the birth parents, because the best interests of the child required that we recreate the genetic ties of what I like to call la famille sauvage, the family in the wild. One mother, one father, can't be two mothers or two fathers, clearly. It has to be the biological kind of notion of family. And the inconvenient extra people, like the woman who gave birth or the father, the man who was the father biologically, have to disappear. And we lived like this kind of notion of what's the best interest of the child for over 100 years, and then boom, we changed again and moved into the open adoption era, in which we suddenly said, you know, people need to know about their backgrounds. We used medical information as an excuse, and then we moved on from there to the notion of genealogical bewilderment. And then we had assisted reproduction bringing us the mix and match families of modern times, with sperm donors and egg donors and gestational surrogates, all of whom become part of this larger notion of family, The law has not yet caught up. The law still doesn't know how to accommodate these extra people, but we're starting to try to find a way to make our peace between this notion of the family as a genetic phenomenon and the family as a social phenomenon. Linked to this, who are my people? Beyond who's my family, who are my people? And here, one of the many websites of the many companies that offer what I facetiously tend to call recreational genetics, because the quality of it tends to be so low, but purports to tell you basically where you're from, right? What percentage of you is, and of course that presupposes that there is a pure something that you're now mixing up. I'm 10% pure X and 20% pure Y, but they purport to tell you that you're from the southwestern coast of Africa, 10%, and then there's 20% of you that's from Southeast Asia. And the fascination with this kind of notion of origins is really interesting because it helps people emotionally feel like they can place themselves in some long history. You probably know somebody who's done one of these tests and proudly says, I'm descended from kings, right? It turns out, by the way, if you take population genetics, you're going to realize that when you talk about that many generations, pretty much all of us have been descended from, by not only kings, the same king, because those genes spread laterally as well as vertically. But there is this sense of how genetics helps us identify our place. I'm a female. I belong to Ethel and John. And we belong to people that went back through Eastern Europe and then into Spain and then into North Africa. And now I know where I'm located in this kind of emotional geography. But it's not just emotional. Because to some extent, the law will adopt some of these things and have real consequences besides your feelings. DNA tribes, by the way, it's not just Native American tribes. They're using the word tribes rather loosely to represent any number of ethnic groupings. Will tell you your genetic ancestry, but in fact, if you were to talk about Native American tribes, you'll see a wide range of attitudes about how you define who is in fact a member of the tribe, with some taking a more kind of political, positivist orientation. Anybody who is admitted into citizenship, which can happen through a variety of means, including naturalization, as we would call in the United States, is a member of the tribe. And others having a much more kind of linear descendant version, or a more blood version, if you like, in which you can't be a member unless somehow you were born into it. Right? So this notion of ancestry has real consequence. And indeed, in one of our neighboring states, Hawaii, there's actually a fair amount of legal significance to whether or not you can trace your ancestry to Native Hawaiians, because the fact that we took the fact that we colonized and then incorporated Hawaii into the United States was associated with the fact that we also created certain kinds of special land rights and other rights to the people who actually had owned the island before us. And you can access those rights, but only if, in some cases, you can show you have at least 50% ancestral Hawaiian, or 50% ancestry dating back to antiquity in Hawaii. And so the search is on. I want access to this kind of opportunity. I want to feel like I own a piece of this property. How can I prove that I have 50% ancestry dating back to antiquity? And suddenly there was a flood of people looking for DNA to show that they had Hawaiian DNA. To their credit, this particular company said, you know, we can tell you a lot about the polymorphisms that are prevalent in Polynesia, which again is an example of an area that for many, many generations had a fair degree of reproductive isolation. But beyond that, we can't specify it anymore, so we can't tell you that you had Hawaiian and you had Tahitian DNA. It doesn't tell us that kind of thing. And yet, if anybody said that it could, the next step would be to find out whether or not the law would accept those results as meaningful in terms of the delivery of actual property rights. The second area I want to talk about where I think that science tends to get overextended either into our emotions or into our legal uses is in the area of prediction. This is the chart that I grew up with. You can see how old I am just by the kind of chart that it is. It looks really old. It is really old. This is the Mendelian genetics that many of us, your parents included, were trained in which we had this idea that genetics was pretty straightforward. There is a gene for something. And you either have the gene or you don't. Or sometimes, just to be a little bit more subtle, there's a gene that only creates a problem if it's matched with its twin gene, and so you have to get a copy from both parents. And if you get only one copy, maybe you don't exhibit the problem, you just pass it on to your children, right? So you'd have these charts with these nice, clean presentations. You have people who are normal, they have no bad gene of this type. This is Huntington's chorea. You have other people who have the disorder, that's in black. This is a very binary thing. You either have the disorder or you don't. There's no gray area about range of presentation or amenability to kind of medical interventions. Notice, by the way, you have very clear male and female. And you can see that this actually gives a very distinct impression that genetics has a high degree of accuracy, predictability, and logic to it. This represents only a small percentage of the situations in which genetics has a role to play. This model of the highly penetrant, highly determinative, simple Mendelian transmission pattern, not the norm. Even though you're reading in the newspaper about the gene for schizophrenia and the gene for depression, there is no single gene for anything. By the way, it's not a gene for, it's a very variant that is associated with, but it doesn't happen like this. It's usually more like this. This is from the NIH website, the Cancer Genetic Markers of Susceptibility Project, which recognizes that in the area of genetics, it's not about a single gene or even a pair of genes. It's about a tremendous number of variables, many of them genetic, not even all of them, which together will help us to understand what your particular susceptibilities might be to a variety of disorders under a variety of circumstances, right? And in this particular kind of situation, we're talking about multiple ways that the genes or the genetics can affect you. Is it a particular variant? Is it that you've got many repeats of something? Is it that you've got too much of something that promotes the activity of another gene? There's different ways these things can interact, all of which is then itself linked to the ways in which your environment, whether it's the uterine environment that you were in as a fetus or the environment you've occupied since then, the personal habits, the degree of exercise, the dietary intake, have all affected how those various factors function. So with something like this project, what they're looking at is a situation where you have tremendous numbers of variables and a fairly low degree of predictability about the outcomes because we're still struggling to identify what all the relevant variables might be. That's why this is so hard. This is an article that was published just a few months ago by Margaret Hamburg. She's the commissioner of the FDA, and Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health. It was an article to announce a collaboration between these two sister agencies on a path toward making personalized medicine more possible. Personalized medicine meaning to take the information we have about somebody and use it to try to tailor our interventions, whether they're preventive or they're curative. But it is not simple because it's not as if there's a single gene that causes or doesn't cause a disease. There's not as if there's a single gene necessarily that's going to be responsible for whether or not you do or do not respond to a drug. But there's hints of these things in many situations. So you will want to test people and say, look, we've got one drug that we use for the prevention of blood clots. And we think that it's possible that the reason why some people do well on this drug and other people don't get much relief and other people wind up bleeding out from it is because of something intrinsic to their bodies and not just the vagaries of medicine and the dosing problem, the usual kind of problem. So you go back and you ask, well, let's look at all these people and find a difference. And you do retrospective studies and you look for differences among them. And you very tantalizingly find that there is a particular gene that seems to have a variant that correlates very closely with their reaction to the drug. Very, very, very suggestive. But retrospective studies are filled with all sorts of pitfalls when it comes to statistical analysis, and it's very easy to draw conclusions that may not be warranted, because that kind of correlation may be due to a causal relationship, or it may be that that variant travels along with something else that really accounts for the different way people are reacting to the drug. So to be able to correlate this, the drug, with the particular genetic variant, takes a fair amount of research. Second problem, we don't really have a good system for verifying that the tests are accurately measuring what they claim to measure. That is, a test for a variant has to first of all be able to accurately identify that the variant is there or not. Then it has to be able to tell us whether or not the variant has the effect we think it has. And then we have to tell whether or not having that effect or not having that effect actually has some value in our clinical management of a case and in the quality of the clinical outcomes. 3 different kinds of issues that have to be resolved for every single variant and every single drug where it might be useful. This is not easy. Worse than that, and we can talk about that some other time, it's not easy to coordinate the development of the tests and the development of the drugs because these are not made by the same people or the same companies. So personalized medicine is one of these constant goals that we hold out as a wonderful path in the future toward having medicines that are the right medicine at the right time, at the right dose for the right person. And it is a wonderful goal, and it's not a completely unrealistic goal, but it's not one that's going to be achieved overnight or even in the next few years. In addition, it's worth noting that not only is this kind of genetics difficult to do, but it also has a context of pharmaceutical development in which the economics of drug development are profoundly affected by the possibility that with genetic variants, we're going to essentially be segmenting the population. So that instead of having one drug that's sold to everybody to lower their cholesterol, you segment the population into 25 different variants of people who have high cholesterol, for whom there's a different drug for each, and now none of those drugs can necessarily be quite as profitable in terms of gross sales as a single blockbuster drug. So there's very active work going on now to try to figure out how to make the economics of personalized medicine function. Is it possible that knowing more about genetics could help us identify the right people to test a drug on, make the trials safer, faster, cheaper, so that you don't have to sell as many pills in order to make back the cost of your investment? I'm moving very fast and very superficially and somewhat confusingly through a lot of different topics, but the goal here is to have people appreciate both the power of genetics but also its limitations. And in this case with personalized medicine, it's a tremendously tantalizing goal, and it's certainly been high on the list for the NIH. Francis Collins has certainly announced that. But it's one that is grounded in the economics of the pharmaceutical industry, and that is not something that's within the control of the people in the laboratory. Another reason why people kind of get both excited and fearful of genetic information is the thought that there's going to be a variety of third-party uses over which they'll have fairly little control. For a long time, a very prevalent fear had been that if my genetic information was known and it had some suggestion of a susceptibility to certain diseases that might be costly, that I might be denied insurance or charged a premium that made it unaffordable. In many ways, this was a fear that was completely overblown because the vast majority of people who were lucky enough to have any health insurance had it through group plans where they paid no attention to the individual genetics or any other aspect of people's individual medical records. They didn't care whether you were going to have cystic fibrosis and you were going to have ALS and you were going to have schizophrenia. They only cared that in a population of 1 million people that subscribed, they would know how many cases of cystic fibrosis, how many cases of schizophrenia, and how many cases of depression, and they would then set a premium that accommodated that amount of payout over the course of their subscribers. So interestingly, even though health insurance was not really the biggest risk, it nonetheless caught people's imaginations. And we saw a constant pattern of people refusing to give genetic information to their physicians, avoiding tests entirely or having tests taken in private clinics where they wouldn't have the results reported to their medical record. It interfered with the quality of medical practice in some cases, and it led to a many-year battle in Congress to pass the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which says that you can't discriminate in health insurance or employment based upon a variety of genetic characteristics, or in this case, more sensibly perhaps, your recent medical history. And it was a fascinating piece of legislation because in many ways it was unnecessary because it was addressing a problem that was not prevalent. The real problem was the number of people who didn't have any insurance. The only people who could really suffer from this were the people who were trying to get insurance on an individual basis and really were getting individual ratings, which was a fairly small percentage of the population. But the legislation had a value nonetheless. It may not have been addressing a real problem in terms of health insurance access for most people, but it was absolutely addressing a real problem in terms of people's fears. You know, Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York where I'm from originally, and one year went into a very interesting exercise. He couldn't actually make the subway safer, but what he did manage to do was get all the graffiti out of the subway so that they didn't look so chaotic. You're tittering, what's the point of that? But actually, if you think about it, the problem wasn't going on the subway and getting mugged, because in terms of relative frequency, not likely to happen. I rode those subways all the time. I never got mugged until I went to vacation on the southern beaches of Nice in France. Go figure, right? Years of New York City subway rides, uneventful, right? The beaches, very dangerous. So what was the real problem on the subways? I mean, yes, for a few people it really was getting mugged or even killed, but for most people it was the fact that they were scared every time they went on the subway. That was real. Whether or not they were actually going to get mugged, the fear was real. And getting rid of the graffiti gave everybody the sense that the subways were no longer controlled by people who were out of control, but they were controlled by the good, upright citizens who don't scribble on their subway cars. And everybody felt safer, and it was real. And it was valuable. I mean, again, people always laugh, but it's a very interesting question about the proper role of law. Is it only to answer an actual kind of empirically justified problem, or is it also about creating a climate in which people feel the confidence to engage in society as opposed to withdrawing from it? It's a very legitimate debate about the role of law, and one can certainly talk about exaggerated legal responses that get a little oppressive and overwhelming because they're supposed to be addressing people's moods. But that's a separate debate from the ones we usually have, where we argue over whether or not the problem is real instead of arguing about what the problem actually is. We now, by the way, have moved into a somewhat different era, because not only do we have Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act signed by President W. Bush, but we also have now the Healthcare Reform Act, which also has, coming into play over the course of the few years that it goes into effect, a prohibition on various kinds of exclusions having to do with pre-existing conditions, of which genetic susceptibilities are one. And it'll be very interesting in some ways to see the degree to which this particular set of concerns finally fades. It'll tell us something about the degree to which this was about genetics per se, or it was about health insurance, right? Is it because we really find genetics so fascinating and intriguing and terrifying because of the who am I questions, that it will remain a hot topic even with all these protections? Or is it really something where once the protections are in place and we get used to them, we'll also get used to the genetics? And only time will tell. Another issue, also for many, many years, employment. I worked for a Congressional Science Policy Agency back in the mid-'80s. One of the hot topics then was genetic testing for employment. The idea was that employers were now going to use tests to screen out employees, both who couldn't handle the job. I'm going to find a genetic test that tells me whether or not my pilots are going to lose their eyesight young, and I'm not going to hire somebody with all that training and then lose him young. Or they're going to use it to try to screen out people who are likely to have more sick days or cost more when it comes to their insurance premiums that the company pays on behalf of the group. And there were a couple of incidents in which this was actually done. Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad was one of the most well discussed, because they were testing people, purportedly testing them for a propensity to various kinds of, I think it was carpal tunnel syndrome. And there was a lot of concern that this was a big deal and we had to prevent the employers from using genetic tests. And that same act, the GINA Act, also prohibits discrimination based on genetics. The thing is, again, it never became a big phenomenon. There were lots of anecdotes, but there wasn't a lot of actual documentable data. Why? Because the genetic tests turned out to be neither cheap enough nor predictive enough to be all that useful to an employer, especially considering how often people moved and changed jobs. But the fear was profound and the legislation was passed. This, on the other hand, is a much more significant issue, because the forensic use of DNA is one of these classic problems of kind of a double-edged sword. Now, forensic DNA is not about seeing what kind of disease you're going to get. It's about identifying basically who you are as compared to somebody else. If you think of yourself as somebody who's got stretches of DNA that can be identified and then read out as if it's a barcode, we can tell who is Mark and who is Randy if we have a reference sample where we know that this particular sample is Mark and this particular sample is Randy. We can compare them, we know which is which. So now I can look at a sample, I can look at the bones of a cadaver, I can look at the victim of a genocide, and I can tell who it was if I have the DNA and I have the reference sample. And the reference sample could come from any number of places. There's increasing availability, actually, of reference samples from things like the military, which is routinely taking samples and storing them so that they can identify soldiers who've been killed in action but don't necessarily still have their dog tags on. We also have other kinds of biological specimen collections in various state hygiene labs and hospitals, some of which have been tapped and others not. And increasingly, we have the police collecting samples at the time either of arrest or conviction, depending upon the state, in which you can then store that sample, and forever after, if a crime is committed, you can see whether or not the suspect is, you can see whether or not some tissue that was left at the site of the crime matches with some samples that you have in storage, and if it does, then you know who your suspect is, and chances are you know who your perpetrator is. And it's very persuasive to juries when you show them. I mean, you've probably seen Bones and CSI and all those other Law and Order magical programs, which make it sound, I mean, actually Bones is my favorite because it's the most completely ludicrous in terms of what they claim to be able to do. But you gotta love the entertainment value. If you have these samples, you can do an awful lot of things. But as much as I would like to be able to rapidly identify who the rapist is, who raped somebody down the street, because it would be very good to be able to figure out whether that's somebody who's raped 3 other women and begin to figure out what the pattern of the rapes is, or could be somebody who's been arrested in the past and now we know exactly who to look for and we can prevent another rape from happening. I am totally for that. But another possible use is where you run the tissue that's left at a crime scene against your reference database, and you don't find a perfect match. What you find are partial matches, which suggest a close familial connection, at least a genetic connection, assuming that you're not dealing with a situation of an adoptive family. And so now here, I know that the DNA sample that I have at the crime scene, I don't know who that is, but I know that that person is closely related to Jane Smith. And Jane Smith now becomes the object of tremendous interest on my part. I can go to Jane Smith, hey, right? Do you have any brothers? Do you have any sisters? Where have they been? What can you tell me? In fact, there was one Law and Order episode that made me actually write to the producer because it was such a violation of civil rights, because they badgered this poor woman and threatened to throw her in jail if she didn't tell them who her brothers were and where they had been, because they had matched a partial sample to her. It makes an entire family suspect. Worse, in some ways, is the way it has ripple effects. After 9/11, there was a desperate need to identify bodies at the Trade Center site. And in many cases, there really wasn't a lot to work from except for tissue samples. And so people who had lost kinfolk were asked, would you offer up some DNA so that we can use you as a reference and identify which samples seem to be closely related to you, and that's probably your mother, your brother, your father, your sister. Lots of people did. Lots of people who didn't want to do that because they were really nervous that if they put their DNA into the system, it would identify yet somebody else in their family as having been a criminal. Or it might identify somebody else in their family as being an undocumented alien, and therefore subject to some kind of deportation proceeding. So the possibility of using things for forensic purposes also creates fear in the civil sphere. Again, with genetics, it's not just the cool things it can do, it's understanding all the ways in which it can be used and beginning to figure out what it is that we want to do in terms of constraints so we can get the good without the bad. Next, as I run through this incredibly fast little discussion, is carrier testing. This is something that is back to the Mendelian model, in which we're imagining that you have people who are healthy but have a mutation which, if it is manifest in their children along with a similar mutation from their partner, is going to result in a terrible disease. And Tay-Sachs testing is really classic. This is a particular genetic problem that is prevalent primarily in the population of Ashkenazi Jews. That's people that come from the Eastern Europe area. Reproductive isolation, again, you begin to see certain genetic traits become more common in certain populations. And here, if you have two people who are carriers and they have a child who happens to get the bad gene from both, then what you've got is a child who is almost 100% certain to die by age 4, usually in a very ugly and horrible way. Problems with carrier testing are well known. Very hard to explain to people that you're healthy, but you have something that you might pass on. Talk about typhoid Mary. She was the healthy woman who could carry the typhus bacillus and couldn't believe that she was actually a threat. Ditto with carrier status, very hard to understand this. And once it's understood, very hard for other people to view you genuinely as healthy. And so we saw a great deal of stigmatization back in the 70s and 80s particularly when it came to identifying people as carriers. Somehow you're tainted. Certainly you're less marriageable, and we even saw in certain populations in Greece and in the United States whole sets of norms around marriage developing in order to avoid having two people who might be carriers marrying one another. And finally, there's the problem of revealing information about your kin. Because if I'm a carrier, it means that I got this from either my mother or my father, which means I now know something about the odds of my mother and father, or I might find out that they're not actually my biological mother and father. Either way, we're revealing information about our kin. And if you think that this is not a real current problem, check out the Washington Post from 9 days ago. Sickle cell testing of athletes stirs discrimination fears. You've probably heard, because students here are likely to be paying attention to athletics, that there's been this unfortunate, no, that was not a reference to the events of yesterday, but there's been this terrible series of sudden deaths among very young, seemingly healthy young men. And a lot of attention being paid to how this could possibly be happening. One thing that seems to be emerging is that the training regimen often results in people being overheated and dehydrated. And the question is, are all people equally susceptible to this problem, or are some people more susceptible, and do we need to treat them differently? Well, it turns out that sickle cell trait, which if you have 2 copies of the sickled version, will give you a set of very specific medical problems that need a lot of medical attention for management. But if you're a carrier, had been the subject in the past of tremendous stigmatization, and indeed one of the more classic cases of genuine employment discrimination against people who carried that particular trait, but actually were perfectly capable of managing the employment. And it set the stage for a whole attitude about carrier testing and its risks. It was also, you got a note, associated with the racialization of genetic testing, because this was a particular trait that is prevalent in the American Black population. It's probably traceable back to West African, I'm not sure if it's West African or East African, but African continent prevalence, and it may be that it was more prevalent there because of the degree to which carrier status conveyed a certain advantage when it came to resisting other diseases. But here in the United States, it simply became a problem of stigma. So here we've got this perfect storm. You've got many young men who are athletes who are also Black, who are now being singled out for special testing to see whether or not they are more susceptible to these training regimens, and naturally there's some concern. Does it mean that it's going to be harder to get accepted into the athletic programs if I'm Black? Does it mean they're going to be nervous about playing me first string as opposed to second string because they're not sure that I am able to withstand the regimen? Or maybe I have the testing so that they can be more careful with me. They make sure I drink more, get more protection from temperature. But this also then means that my family's going to probably know something that they didn't know before. And how ready are we to begin to discuss this, considering the degree of misunderstanding there's been about this disorder? And so the decision was made that we won't test just Black athletes, we're going to test all athletes. That makes some sense too, because in fact, sickle cell trait is not something restricted to the African American population. It's just that the frequency is higher, but anybody can have it. And in fact, every year that passes by, as the dating norms change and the reproductive patterns change, the chances of it being isolated within one ethnic or racial category begin to go down, because in fact, everybody's been mixing and matching with everybody else. And pretty soon we're all going to look Brazilian, right? Which, at least my family, would be an improvement. But if we test everybody, we run into a different problem. Because, you know, genetics is not just biology, it's statistics. And if you test a lot of people, most of whom don't have something, there's always going to be a certain number of mistakes that creep in. And you're going to get a number of what we call false positives, people who are identified but don't actually have it. And the more that your population is made up of people who actually don't have it, the lower the percentage of true positives in there, the bigger the problem of the false positives. Just a matter of statistics. And so as soon as you decide that for the sake of equality and dealing with people's nervousness and dealing with our lack of confidence that our athletic programs will be able to deal with the issue of carriers in a way that is neither discriminatory nor intrusive, we may be developing a program that is mathematically lower quality. And doing it for purely social reasons to deal with the emotional burden of dealing with this kind of genetic information. Again, is this a legitimate choice? Is certainly debatable, because we have this idea of optimized science, but we also have to deal with societal understandings and societal reactions, which for many people may be viewed as being irrational and unjustified, but that doesn't make them less real. And we're always caught with the question of whether or not we're legislating for what is the science issue, or whether we're legislating for what is the societal phenomenon. Last in this particular segment, I don't know how much time I've got, I don't have a clock here. He's waving, oh, go ahead. Is the very fraught question of how you handle genetic testing when it comes to reproductive decision-making. If I am a carrier, and I happen to be mating with somebody who's also a carrier, and I know that I've got a chance of passing something on. Now we're still talking this kind of simplistic Mendelian example just for the sake of simplicity, even though I told you not to do that. You see, I fall into the same trap as everybody. What can you do about this? One of the newest techniques is something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where if an embryo is created outside the body using in vitro fertilization, one of the cells of the embryo can actually be plucked off and examined to see what particular sequences it has and whether or not that embryo has sequences that code for a serious disorder, like Tay-Sachs, for example. And then people who've made multiple embryos that are now sitting outside the body ready for transfer in order to implant and go to term can choose that I'm going to use that embryo but not that one, because that embryo over here we know is going to result in a child who's got a very high probability of having a serious illness. So I'll use this embryo. This, by the way, is often mistakenly called designer babies, because there's nothing you can design here. It's selected babies, not designer babies, because you're deciding to select among choices that were not yours to make. They were just the choices that were given to you, right? And in fact, the pattern of its use has been pretty much restricted to very serious disorders. Nonetheless, the fact that you select to not use certain embryos is absolutely linked closely to the debate around the moral and legal obligations we have to facilitate the development toward birth of every stage of viable human life. It's also engendered a very interesting debate about frivolous as opposed to acceptable uses, where frivolous uses are usually considered to be those that do not relate to a serious disorder, but to something less serious, or something that we shouldn't care about at all. So for example, if you knew that there was a way to predict that this embryo would develop into a child that had a higher than typical chance of developing obesity, would you be tempted to select against it? Would that answer depend on whether or not there was an equally viable embryo ready to go right next to it that didn't have that particular susceptibility? This is the dilemma that often people have with the use of this genetics, which is not that the uses themselves are necessarily wrong, but that they create a set of choices we never had before that'll ineluctably lead us to certain kinds of choices, because it's just too tempting to not want to make things as good as they can be. What parent doesn't want to make things as good as they can be? And the fear is that that leads to a really outrageously exaggerated notion of what's acceptable and unacceptable. Now, on the one hand, this is a real concern. I am probably the only person in American history who went on a congressionally sponsored and funded tour of California sperm banks. And it was one of the great pleasures of my life as a congressional aide. And let me tell you something about this. When I brought back all the brochures, and just for the fun, because congressional aides are like that, we just posted them all on the walls, and it was all men, obviously, it was sperm donors, not egg donors, and all the women in the office, we used like dartboards to choose which guys we would take for our sperm donors, right? But it was actually a very sobering lesson, because take a look at what people were choosing, right? people, they were choosing guys who were tall, they were choosing guys who were slender, and at least these were physiological characteristics, right? Choosing ones who can play the cello was a much more attenuated notion about the transmissibility of something, unless you're talking maybe perfect pitch. Choosing somebody who had high SAT scores, I mean, that correlates with how much money your parents had and what social capital they had, more than it particularly correlates with anything that we can identify as genetic. But nonetheless, people were drawn to what seemed to be the most advantageous choices. I mean, no, I can fully confess to doing the same thing. I got the tallest guy I could to average with me. I got the skinniest guy I could to average with me, and I got somebody with very dark skin so, you know, my kid wouldn't get sunburned. And I thought this would make my kid better off than if I just, you know, did what I would probably do if I went ahead and had kids with the guy I was dating at the time. Right? And indeed, if I thought about it more, I realized that if my mother had had these choices, that there's no way she would have, she would never have looked at a piece of paper and said, yes, I want the guy who's short with a pot belly and a tendency to balding. Absolutely not the first choice on these things. So, and indeed, in one California sperm bank, they no longer even accepted donors who were under 5'9" because, as Cappy Rothman, who ran that sperm bank, said, there was insufficient demand for the inventory. For those of you who out there who are 5'9" or under, by the way, which is both my brothers, by the way, I can only say, welcome to my club, because when I tried to do a little participant observer research by volunteering to be a surrogate mother, I was turned down as being commercially non-viable as well. My point is that given these kinds of abstracted sets of characteristics without the surrounding sense of humor, the fact that this is a person that you knew your cousin, the fact that this is a person who is very responsible and puts your needs first, abstracted from all of that, height and eye color and cello playing suddenly take on more importance than they ever would before because they're the only things you know. So with PGD, there were interesting political wins coming from both sides, from people who were from the more kind of conservative end of American politics who were very focused on trying to reduce the incidence of abortion or anything like abortion. They were concerned that PGD was an invitation for us to discard future people because they were imperfect, and it was the fact of the discarding, imperfect or otherwise, that was upsetting. And for other people coming from the far other end of the spectrum was the concern that we were creating many more gradations of acceptability or even commercial viability in the kinds of traits that we were willing to tolerate. And so this debate, which had started as, can I please help you not have a child who's going to die before the age of 4, suddenly was overwhelmed by discussions having to do with abortion and individual market-driven eugenics. And the 4-year-old with the Tay-Sachs almost got lost in between, and one of the issues then was the call for legislation and regulatory limits on the moral choices that people make. Of course, it's not just pre-implantation. Prenatal screening is also something that's done historically by amniocentesis. This is what I started with, my own experience at age 15, in which women who got this diagnosis were suddenly faced with a very interesting phenomenon, which Barbara Katz-Rothman, a sociologist from CUNY in New York, had called the tentative pregnancy. Because before you got pregnant, then basically you bonded with the idea that you're going to have a baby. But now you kind of waited until the second trimester when your test came back, and you hoped that the test was going to be good, because if not, you might have to decide to end the pregnancy. And you didn't completely bond with the idea of your future until you kind of clear these hurdles, right? And having got that choice, suddenly it became your responsibility. If a child was born with Down syndrome and you didn't stop it from happening, you're responsible for Downs in a way that before nature, God, fate, whatever your particular way of describing these phenomena might be, had been responsible. Changed the emotional dynamic of the experience completely. It even opened you up to a degree of criticism from other people for how dare you bring a child into the world who's going to suffer, or how dare you bring a child into the world that we have to pay for. So that the whole phenomenon of being able to exercise choice, again, is something where it's an incredibly valuable and important kind of tool to be able to prevent suffering. And yet, in its context, it has implications that go far beyond the mere ability to prevent the suffering of an individual. Chorionic villus biopsy made it a little bit earlier in the pregnancy, and ironically, although this was an advance because it made it safer fewer miscarriages from the procedure, and emotionally easier often for the pregnant women because it was earlier on in the pregnancy, less time to have to live in that weird state of tentative connection to your future. It also began to engender a public reaction to the idea that somehow we were making it so easy to choose not to carry a pregnancy to term that it was going to trivialize it. And again, it was going to first encourage people to do it for less than significant reasons. But more than anything, it was going to really begin to edge into our notion about what is an acceptable choice in reproduction, because it's so easy. And this then began to connect to the disability rights movement. To what degree do we become less tolerant of people who have disabilities? Because we know that they didn't have to really be here, right? And even if that's not what happens, because maybe that's an exaggeration, we also know that power comes in numbers. And if literally the number of children born with Down syndrome has dropped by many orders of magnitude since the initiation of amniocentesis and chorionic villus biopsy, to the extent that political movements are driven by numbers, you have far fewer children with this disorder and far fewer families to advocate for them, and you really do change the political dynamic by changing the numbers, right? My sociology friends always talk about how demography is destiny. So here again, the ironies of something that's done with the best of intentions to try to prevent suffering and try to help people take control of their lives and their futures has this kind of context that nobody standing there in that room with the woman who got that karyotype that I did was going to be talking about. Nobody was going to talk to her about whether or not her choice or our options were going to be part of a larger social movement that helped to dictate whether or not we were going to spend the money for curb cuts and ramps to our public buildings. And this, again, is a very difficult thing because now we're talking about looking at individual choices and the kind of collective effect of individual choices, and there's no good theory about when we should limit those choices for the sake of some very amorphous notion of the public good that may or may not need this intervention. And this, indeed, is one of the reasons why genetics has engendered such passionate debate, because partly it's about how broadly people look out at the ripple effects and how drastically they want to try and control where those effects go. This, in sum, is many of the reasons why I think we have this phenomenon of genetic exceptionalism. This idea that genetic information is uniquely powerful because it tells something about me, it tells something about my children, it tells something about my future, it tells something about my family. That the risks of the use of the information is somehow greater and different than the risks of other information, even information that we know is even more predictive. You want to know whether or not I'm going to cost a lot of money to your insurance company next year? Don't look at my genes. Look at how much money I cost the insurance company last year. If I was in the hospital last year, that's the most predictive fact you could have. But that doesn't have the same call on us because genetics kind of has that predictive value and has all these other things too, right? I can identify a different piece of information that has information about me or information about my family, but there are a few things that seem to have all these things packed in one. And it leads to this idea that we need to have some kind of special regime that's genetics focused. And there's also historical reasons for this, beyond this kind of practical stuff I've been talking about. The 19th and 20th centuries were a period in which a whole theory of eugenics had developed, and it was developed again with the best of intentions in many cases. It was a real social hygiene, a public health movement to try and clean up the gene pool and improve the quality of human health. It was done with the best up-to-date science and the best of intentions. No question about it. But it also tended to get extended a little bit beyond where the science actually could take it. So in the 19th century, it was used to explain not whether or not the finches had beaks that were long or short in order to crack the seeds. It was used to explain why it is that some people are poor and some people are rich, as if the inheritance of wealth had nothing to do with this, right? But this phenomenon of social Darwinism captured people's imaginations to the point that when I took that sperm bank tour and I went down to Escondido and I went to the so-called Nobel Prize winner sperm bank, run by Robert Clark Graham, I found out from him that his motivation had been growing up in a small town where he saw that the poor people were having lots of children, but the upper class people were having smaller families. And this was definitely going to dirty the gene pool because obviously poverty was somehow heritable through your genes. He was a very interesting character, by the way. This is a bit of an aside, but he was an optometrist. He worked in a room above a bank. There was no laboratory of any sort, but he always walked around with his little white coat as if he was in some kind of lab setting. And he actually didn't have any Nobel Prize winners whose semen had ever been used. No, seriously. I mean, there was one Nobel Prize winner who had agreed to do this, but in fact his semen was never used. And beyond that, who were the men in his sperm bank? They were mostly graduate students. They did the work anyway, Mark Clisson said. Graduate students and young assistant professors. And then, wait, no, seriously, I did ask him this. And I said, how do you know which ones to pick? And he said, well, I listen to the radio and I watch TV and I listen to them talk. And I decide which ones are smart. It's like, okay. And then he volunteered entirely on his own. He goes, and I pretty much stick to the natural sciences because with the social sciences and humanities, you never really know. If those of you that are looking for a career in congressional work, I highly, highly advise you to take it up because you'll be exposed to things that'll never happen to you at Berkeley. Back to more serious stuff, right? This social Darwinism thing actually is very serious because, again, there are these things that for some reason we tend to incorporate into our very being. It's like, oh, but that makes sense. And it's very hard to dislodge it, even though every biology professor you have is going to talk to you about how foolish this is. Because to the extent that there is any correlation between certain genetic traits and social class, it's going to be attributable to any number of other things. It'll be attributable to things like those people who have a tendency toward disease are themselves likely to perhaps not succeed very well in business. And you go to the third world, and half the problem is that people are sick all the time. They're from infectious disease. So it's very hard to economically develop when half the time you're feeling sick or somebody in your family is sick that you're nursing. It can also be, excuse me, that you have, again, reproductive isolation. In Jane Austen's time, you really didn't marry outside your social class unless you were Elizabeth Bennet. This kind of eugenic thinking really came to a fore in the 20th century. In the United States, we had both reproductive controls by sterilizing poor people, sterilizing African Americans, because they were going to have inferior children. We sterilized people who had various psychiatric disorders that may or may not have any genetic contributions. We had immigration controls in order to prevent more of these suboptimal people from coming in. That's why for many of you, if you come from families that have backgrounds in Southern Europe, Turkey or Italy or Greece, chances are your grandparents and great-grandparents had difficulty getting into the United States because there were barriers, because those people were considered inferior. It really bloomed, of course, we all know, mid-20th century with Nazi ideology, which really most kind of concretely categorized people and then set out to slaughter people for their supposed genetic inferiority. And that's the background with which we come to the questions of reproductive screening in the late 20th century and our Nobel sperm bank. So is it any wonder that even the most incremental and well-intentioned and self-contained applications of genetics to learn just a little something tend to result in some large discussion about things that are only tangentially related? It's because of all of the distrust that comes from the historical background about the ways these things, in some settings, have grown out of control. Does that mean that you stop all work on genetics or all clinical use of genetics? I'd hope not, because there are so many advantages to it. But it does mean that it's very difficult to discuss it as if it is only this test or only this clinical intervention or only this drug trial, without having some awareness that for many people it's going to be evocative of an emotional connection to who I am or a political connection to what might happen with the information. Despite all this, interestingly, as we move into the 21st century, attitudes on genetic testing really changing. I'm sorry that I left out the slide that showed what they were about 20 years ago, but they're certainly quite conservative compared to this. Here you'll see that you've got surveys that show that many people want genetic testing, even if there's no particular use for the information, which is particularly interesting because it's not clear what you get except for some, I don't know if it's peace of mind or a sense of doom, depending upon what the information says about you. And, excuse me, let me go back here. And then again, views on personalized medicine, a variety of questions that were asked just last year about whether or not having this information might change your behaviors. We all think We all like to think that it would change your behaviors in order to protect yourself against your susceptibilities. Francis Collins tells a story about how he went ahead and had genome testing and discovered he had a slightly elevated risk of diabetes. Anybody who's ever seen him, by the way, knows that this is absurd. The guy's in phenomenal shape, but he had a slightly elevated risk of diabetes, and that led him to lose the extra 10 pounds that, made his risk go down by 0.001%. But he tells that story over and over. You'll find it in the New Yorker article that was just written about him. That's what people hope. Tell them about their susceptibility, and they are going to change their behavior in order to guard against that outcome. And some people will. The fear, though, is that for other people, if you tell them that they are not particularly susceptible, they're going to go, wee, fantastic, hamburgers all around, and they're going to pretend that they're not at risk at all. One of my friends at Hopkins did this very interesting research on how people absorb probabilistic information. Some people absorb it very mathematically. Well, I know that I've got about a 20% chance of something. Other people tend to be very binary thinkers, and at 20%, they'll either decide they're going to get it or they're not. And they live their lives as if I'm doomed or as if I'm free. Because to live with a 20% chance is just like, how do I do that? What do I do with that? And people really, interestingly, binarily broke out into these two groups of how people absorb information. And so it's a really interesting question that's still out there, how various kinds of people will react to specific kinds of information having to do with specific diseases and behavior types, whether it will be what we call disinhibiting and allowing them to do things that they might not have done before, or whether it's going to cause them to be more disciplined, or a little bit of both. Let me just conclude by asking whether in this century, after all of this experience and all of these applications, we should still think about genetics as exceptional. From my perspective, I think we should stop. I think we should stop because over and over what we've seen is it's not the genetics, it's the way the society around it uses the genetics, absorbs the genetics, reacts to the genetics, and feels about the genetics. It's not the genetics in and of itself. And so I don't think we need to treat the genetics as exceptional. I think we need to treat the society as exceptional, and every decade is a different kind of society. Different laws, different norms, different prejudices, different idiosyncrasies, different idiocies, and those are the things that determine whether or not an action or a piece of information is going to be useful or not, scary or not, subject to abuse or not. And so I would say it's time for us to move beyond thinking of genetics as the end-all and be-all. Let's notice, first of all, that we've now got this blossoming science of so-called epigenetics, which is now taking the environmental influences that the scientists have always talked about, but have been casually dropped out of the press reports that call it, that hype today's gene for schizophrenia, and are now looking at the biological mechanisms by which the environment influences how genes act, when they act, how dramatically they act, whether or not they are acting in concert or out of concert and out of sync with some other particular genetic sequence. And that is going to, I hope, make us far more aware of the fact that it is not our genetics alone that can ever really tell us very much. With the rare exception of the Huntington's chorea diagram, most of the time the genetic information will be meaningless if we don't have the context for it. The person, the environment, the diet, the behavior. Second, the wonders of transportation and dating norms and the decline of pure groups will, I think, change the way we do genetics, because our current search for the genetic variant for this or that is highly dependent on having subpopulations that are rich in that variant. Not immediately, because reproductive time is slow, but not that far from now, we're going to find it harder and harder to find those population subgroups that are rich in those variants, and we're going to need to think about a different way to do this. And it's also going to mean, perhaps, a decline in thinking of those subgroups as somehow special in and of themselves because of their genetics. I think that the disability rights movement, I like to think, but I'm certainly, subject to a lot of disagreement on this, I like to think that it matured to the point that they are not vulnerable to being completely squelched, even if numbers drop. But that is certainly a matter of debate. But I think that that has been a really profound and permanent change in our notion of normal. And that's a very welcome change, because it's not just people with disabilities, it's people with abilities of every sort that are now being embraced in a much wider notion of what is the range of normality, so that we build a world that accommodates and embraces people of all sorts of normality. And I will welcome that when they build kitchens that have cupboards I can reach. And finally, the changing American family and the idea of personal relationships. This is ground zero for the changing nature of the family. Every wacky case I ever studied as a law student or a law professor having to do with sperm donation, egg donation, gestational surrogates, contract motherhood, every case started in California. I don't know what is in the water here that makes it seem so exciting to do things nobody else has done before, and gives such a headache to all the lawyers that have to sort out the personal relationships. But I do personally thank you for opening up the notion of family to something beyond the pure notion of blood, and once again reminding people that family is many things, about emotion, about economic interdependence, and about the notion of seeing oneself in one's children. Whether you see that because it's the same color hair, or you see it because, regardless of the genetics, that kid has the same strange kind of tic that you have whenever you laugh, right? So I would say that the older questions in genetics were always whether the government should control the information, whether we should stop people from having access to information, whether we should stop any use of the genetic information. Some of the questions seem to be fairly extreme in the choices that they seem to offer. It was ban this or stop that. And I think the newer questions are, I think, a little more subtle. I think the questions are how to make the information truthful, and that is not trivial. Truthful and not misleading when you've got tests that are not adequately validated, when you've got people being given information without the context in which you can understand it. Even information that is technically accurate can nonetheless be misleading. And we have to think about what it means to make sure that consumers and patients actually are getting information that is truly truthful and not misleading. And then we have to ask, what are the lawful purposes and the unlawful purposes that we think information should be used for? Where are the moments we think it is appropriate to discriminate in the sense of differentiating among people for various things, and where do we think that it is not appropriate? In the end, I would simply say that I don't think that if we're asking the question, who am I? Who are my family? Who are my people? What is my future? I don't think you should be looking in your genes, because all you're going to find are sugars and phosphates. Thank you very much.
Professor Charo will be able to take a few questions, especially from students perhaps in the audience. Any questions?
I've talked you all into submission.
Yeah. I'll ask a question to get things going then. You danced around an issue that I know you've done work on, and that has to do with an issue we've addressed as part of our program of direct-to-consumer DNA testing. Fraught with issues, and the government seems to be on the precipice of coming out with regulations that will determine a lot about the future of direct-to-consumer testing in our country, at least. How do you think about this as a lawyer and an ethicist, not as a government regulator, but in the mode of an academician? What are the things we should be worrying about as we each individually formulate our own opinions about direct-to-consumer testing?
We've got a lot of industries in the United States that have created markets for themselves. Mouthwash industry created a market for itself by making halitosis a social disease, right? Only the people as old as me are tittering, because that seems to have dropped off the ad collection. We create needs through advertising. And so we do recognize that to some extent, the notion of what is important to us and not important to us is not somehow intrinsic. It's about a give and take between what I kind of want and what you've now made attractive to me and made me want. And direct-to-consumer advertising of genetic tests is, at this point, because it's really in its infancy, is still at that point in which it's creating its own market. The market hasn't developed yet. It's creating its own market by advertising all the cool things that you can do with it. And so we're seeing everything ranging from ancestry testing to testing for certain traits that have very strong, known, well-validated correlations with certain kinds of medical conditions that may be amenable to a particular kind of intervention. And I'm thinking now about things like the BRCA1 and BRCA2 variations that are associated with a much higher than typical probability of developing breast or ovarian cancer. And then we see advertisements for things that have a much weaker basis for a claim of having any genuine, usefulness according to what they're claiming. So you see advertisements for things that will tell you what kind of vitamins you ought to take to make yourself more fertile, right? It's all over the map. So I think of it really the way I think about consumer protection issues. And again, the question is, how do you make information truthful, not misleading, and not subject to abuse? I think we're not yet at the point where we know that the information is actually truthful. Now, let me step back and say one more thing about that, because there's a real nugget of a dilemma here about the notion of truthfulness, and that's who owns the answer to what is truthful. So right now, if you want to advertise a drug, and I'm going to start with drugs now, you want to advertise a drug, you have to advertise it only for an indication that you have proven to the satisfaction of the Food and Drug Administration is supported by the data. So here's the interesting dilemma. Here I am, I may have all sorts of information that shows that this drug does something great. This antihistamine puts people to sleep. We all know this is true, right? We all know it's true. So, I want to advertise my Benadryls as a sleeping aid. We all know it's true. But you can't advertise it as a sleeping aid unless the FDA says you can, because you haven't proven it to the FDA. Now, partly that's because of a distrust of having a kind of uncontrolled marketplace in truth, which is itself a very interesting phenomenon. Here it's the government has the monopoly on what is true, right? But on the other hand, think about the non-monopoly of truth in an area as complex as drug development. The real issue there actually is about incentivizing the research, because if you could advertise it without having to prove the research to somebody else, then there's no incentive to ever do the research, and indeed we'd never know the truth of anything by anybody for any drug at all. So it's really about a carrot and stick kind of phenomenon. But that's how we do it with drugs, right? You have to prove it to the FDA. Well, genetic tests are considered diagnostics. Diagnostics are regulated just like drugs. Well, there's a different regulatory scheme, but they are regulated just as are drugs. And again, the question is, should we have to prove to the satisfaction of the government that the tests are sensitive and specific enough to measure what they claim to measure, that what they're measuring is actually linked to what they claim it's linked to, whether it's infertility or it's your ability to get sunburned or whatever, and then finally whether or not that information is in fact going to make a difference in the clinical outcomes once the information is used in conjunction with a drug or a vaccine or whatever. And for the moment, the government has not entered that field in a big way, because the industry was pretty small and the academic base was handling it more or less. When they start advertising and creating a market, they create a bigger industry. Create a bigger industry, you create a bigger population of people who could be flim-flammed or harmed if the information is not valid. You create a bigger incentive for the government to say, you know something, we need to control this. Not to say that people aren't entitled to the information, but that nobody's entitled to sell people bogus information. A very fine line. And by the way, last comment on this business about who owns the truth and what you can say. This is a real moving target, because the pharmaceutical industry and the device industry have very steadily been using litigation to push on the edges of those rules on the basis that the First Amendment says that the government cannot abridge the freedom of speech except under the most extreme circumstances where there's no other way to protect some compelling public interest. And their argument is, if we actually have data that shows that something is safe and effective, then squelching our speech is not answering a compelling need, nor is it the only way that you could answer the question about investment in research. And so we may see all the rules change based on a First Amendment argument.
Other questions? Let's thank Professor Charo again for this.
Thanks very much.